because that is life. Right? You will get farther in life if you are a squeaky wheel.
At least in Western world.
Yes.
If you have that many nails sticking up though, I think the craft suit is to blame, but not the nails.
So I determined through my thought process that I've been doing the last 24 hours that I don't think it's feasible for us to take an exam in a week. So I am going to put that off by a week. We're going to take our second exam instead of week 6, week 7, and that puts us on pace to take an exam 3 week 10, which I think was probably the plan anyway. I don't think it makes sense for us to really do something over finals week. I'm going to try to avoid doing something over finals week. So 3 exams, week 3 already done, week 7, week 10 was probably going to be what shakes out. Yeah, I don't like to give exams on non-Fridays just because I like it to be consistent on a daily basis. On a daily, exams are that day for this class. Like, yeah, I'm gonna push it back. I want to push it back. Any concerns about that, or anyone who really wants to argue for we should have an exam next week instead of on week 7?
Nothing that'll get outvoted by the rest of you.
Right? I still want to hear the arguments, if that is the case, but
The test would be shorter, right?
the test would be shorter and the next one would be longer. It's the same, we're going to cover the same content. It's a matter of when are do we want to try to equalize the amount of content on each exam, or do we want one of them to be, I'm really stretching for some questions, so there's some questions that are stretches and others where.
That one. Just to play devil's advocate with fun here, this pressure makes diamonds, and within that week of pressure, we could learn quite a bit. And lots of things are made under way too bad of time crunches. And using that argument of game one, of games made in a short time, New Vegas was made in 18 months, and it's still an incredibly good narrative and gameplay.
The question is,
wasn't it also horribly buggy?
it was horribly buggy on release. I very much remember
That's the game though, so that was.
heads doing some pretty fun on release. And what is also the mental health of those developers over those 18 months? How are they doing now? Have they recovered from the crunch?
I mean, pretty good.
How do you know? Or you want to?
They made the Outer Worlds, and which is pretty
It's
much
the same company. Is it the same developers?
Well, that I don't know, and it has to do with the guy, so I can't prove anything there.
All right, let's dive into it because we have a little bit to cover, and we may actually get to an activity today, which would be fun. It's not a paired activity. This is more of an individual activity, but looking at where we are and where we might get to, that could be pretty fun. So last time we were in the process of talking about different kinds of game resources. We were starting to dive into time as a resource, and usually it is the most important resource because it can be the player's time, the game time, how you design for the appropriate and carve up the game into the appropriate sections to make it feel like a cohesive experience. We were talking about player expectations, being able to reward players for the time they put into your game. How do you design for those player rewards? It is also worth noting that player expectations very much differ depending on the type of game that they are playing. A single player game has different levels of player expectation for balance and for reward than a massively multiplayer online game. And the design of those are very different as well. You can, in a single player game, there is no limit to the amount of dopamine you can inject into your players' brains. In an MMO, you have to balance things players against players. If you design an MMO where it's very easy to get the best items in the game, then as a live service, it's very unlikely that your players are going to want to play the game over the long period, or you're going to need to continue to design new, less easily acquirable gear and release expansions or content every frequently. We can also talk about something like the complexity of actions, having some number of action points per turn. That's another way that we can incorporate time where a turn is a certain number of action points. More powerful actions cost more action points. Less powerful actions cost fewer action points. You can introduce cooldowns as a way of standardizing time. So more powerful abilities are so powerful we don't want players spamming them. They can only use them every so often. So there's some waiting period forcing them to use other mechanics that maybe aren't quite as overpowered. But now it becomes given a particular time period, how can I break down my options for engaging with these different skills and mechanics so that over the long term, I'm dealing the most damage, I'm healing the most health, whatever it is that you're trying to do. MMOs typically make everything a cooldown to make sure that you're optimizing not just for the individual skills that you're gaining, but for the longer picture of a rotation of skills over a period of time so that you can map their cooldowns to each other so that you consistently have something to do and the total amount of whatever it is you care about damage over that period is optimized or maximized from the player's perspective. So making sure that you're designing for that, you can break it down into the associated chunk of time. Every 30 seconds, what are my players doing? If they have this skill at level 5, this skill at level 3, and here are the associated cooldowns based on my balance, can they chain these skills together to last 30 seconds of uninterrupted gameplay? Can they chain these together to last for a minute of uninterrupted gameplay? What is that desirable, or do you want them to run out of skills to use? Then they have to act defensively or dodge. And then you could map boss mechanics to those times, maybe when the player skills are on cooldown, so they're less trying to do damage and they have less to do. Maybe they're going to be more likely to be receptive to large damaging boss mechanics that they will more easily see because there's less visual clutter on the screen. So you can start to map these and understand what are the players doing, how can we design boss mechanics inside of that whole system. There's also production times or build times in games where there is construction. So the time between when you pay for it and when it is ready for use. This in a real-time strategy game is something like I'm going to pay for a unit, but then I have to wait before that unit is ready to use. And that can be another way of balancing time, a way of saying you can't instantly use your resource to produce. Now you have to plan, use strategy to anticipate what the game is going to throw at you so that you are ready for it, so that you don't have to react immediately to, or you don't have the ability to react immediately when the game throws a challenge at you. So different ways to elicit different kinds of strategy or tying time to different kinds of mechanics that allows your player, I guess the way I want to say it is I hate English sometimes. It feels the same as the game does. So if the game is a planning game, then you introduce planning-based mechanics so that the user can't circumvent the planning to be successful. They have to plan successfully to be successful at the game. And then all of the mechanics involve some kind of planning, from troop management to resource management. You have to acquire the resources to be able to make the units. You can't gather that instantly. You can't create the units with your gathered resources instantly. You have to plan for that ahead of time. So all of the mechanics of a real-time strategy game are based around that kind of planning and anticipation. And it makes the game feel cohesive in that it's always asking you to use the same sets of skills in all of its mechanics. Movement speed is a very important part of time and the perception of time. So how fast are you able to move through the game world or the design space? If you're slow at this, then it can feel like that's very good in a world where you're supposed to appreciate the beauty of the world, where it's atmospheric, where each encounter is very strategic. But if it's a very action-oriented game where the player is responding quickly to things that are around the screen, then if your movement speed is slow to compensate for that, it almost feels like it's tugging against what the mechanics want your brain to be doing. So making sure that movement speed aligns with the kinds of mechanics that your game is trying to get your player to utilize, then it's important as part of that. So other thing to think about is the different kinds of systems that are affected by the movement speed. So something like maybe an encounter rate. If you're able to move through a zone very quickly, it'll be less time between each particular encounter. If the enemies are the same, evenly spaced out, that may be a good thing. That may be a bad thing. If your game's not renowned for its combat system and is more renowned for its visual exploration, then maybe you want to slow that movement speed down so the player is spending less time proportionally in combat. There's also the perceived size of levels. There's an actual size to the level, but depending on how fast you can move through the game world, it will seem to be very differently sized if it takes 20 minutes to cross the game map or 2 hours to cross the game map, even though it's the same size. There's also the ease of the controls. If your character moves too slowly or too quickly, the controls can start to feel better or worse, even though they're the same controls. How easy is it to dodge something? If you move quickly, you can get out of the way of an incoming projectile a lot more efficiently than if your character moves more slowly. Significantly more game mechanics or game systems. Any other that you can think of off the top of your head?
I mean, combat in general is affected huge by movement speed.
Yeah.
In some games, you can even turn on what's called a turbo mode, where the animations of everyone is faster and everyone moves quicker. Which kind of
Using temporary items as well to change your movement speed in the short term can be something that allows the player to decide when they want to move quickly and when they want to move more slowly.
Again, my main thought goes back to combat simply because if a boss is slower, but you can whip around it constantly and easily dodge everything, that affects that combat massively.
Yeah.
Especially if most of the players are a lot slower, that one sort of meta kind of breaks the purpose of that encounter.
You can also, as a player, circumvent an entire defensive system by moving so quickly that you dodge things based on that. So if, as a designer, you want your players to take your defensive system seriously, then the first thing to think about is not the defensive system or the amount of damage, but maybe how fast your player characters are moving. Do they actually need to have defense because they have to take hits? We can talk about the different kinds of currency a game can throw at you. So currency is a nice, if it's something like gold, an all-purpose resource that can be used as, we're going to talk about this momentarily, next week probably, anchors and the ability to tie something to everything in the game. Currency allows you to exchange resources for other resources, rather than giving you resources and making your game economy based on a barter system where you need to exchange some resource for a resource. You can exchange a resource for some kind of currency and then have exchange rates within your game's economy for that. You can also utilize currency for information. Currency can be used to speed things up, to save player time. Currency can be an all-purpose useful resource for that. There are, of course, premium currencies in free-to-play games that is used as a translation for the real money that's been spent on the game, and or advertisements that have been watched, or players that you've gotten to sign up for and try out the game. So we can break this down into in-game currency, anything that is earned by a player through interacting with the game, through interacting with the game world. They acquire that currency through gameplay. Real world currency, some currency that you're going to, it's something like gambling games where you use real money as the currency in the game, or some kind of asset cosmetic that you can purchase. They can get obscenely expensive in games like, I use the term game lightly, Star Citizen. We have the concept of a pay-to-win currency. So real money can be exchanged for either saving time or even as a balance or a difficulty metric. You can tune down the difficulty by getting buffs or getting. It can become a roadblock. And we'll actually talk about this a lot in a lot more detail when we talk about game economies, because if you have some kind of pay to win game, the entire economy is structured around this concept. We'll talk about that in a lot more depth when we get there. We have game specific objects. So this is anything that the player can find in the game, anything that they can put in their inventory, they can collect, they can take possession of, some way that you can, with that resource, you can use that resource directly or indirectly to affect the future game, the future gameplay, your place in the game's world. So something like wood in a real-time strategy game is a specific object. You can use that wood to construct buildings, and those buildings can research technologies or construct units. Bullets in a first-person shooter. Healing potions in an RPG, any kind of specific object that is not currency, but it's something that you can collect for use at a time when it is relevant to you, or you can use to optimize some other objective in the game. As the game continues, as it evolves, you can find ways for those resources to become more valuable or less valuable. So via the use of some kind of inflation, maybe in a real-time strategy game, as you go through some number of ages, the technologies become more and more expensive. So the wood that you collected early in the game becomes less and less valuable as the game progresses, because everything, it becomes less and less of a proportion of the next upgrade. And that allows, it motivates the player to want to spend the resources they have when they acquire it, because as the game evolves, that becomes less and less valuable. So it's kind of a use it or lose it mentality that you're designing for the player, rather than hoarding that resource. You want to give them a reason to use it. Hit points and lives. These aren't actual collectible objects in the game, but a lot of game challenge comes out of managing your player's life or hit points. And of course, it's not just for the player, enemies have them as well. So you can make a lot of interesting design decisions around modifying HP values. Of course, whether the game is paced correctly or incorrectly manages to make this concept more effective or less effective as you're trying to manage your own hit points. So if the pacing is good, then managing hit points feels natural, feels like you're making important decisions. On the other hand, I'll go back to another of my favorite examples. In Path of Exile, it's very easy to get one shot at the end of the game. There is no HP management. You're either alive or you are dead. There is no management of your HP. It all comes from, are you dodging correctly? Yes or no?
They hate us one-shotting things.
Not true in Path of Exile. We can talk about experience and levels as well. So how is the character progressing? This is a game resource. So balancing for your player's character's growth is an important mechanic. So experience points, you should probably all know this, but it's a reward for engaging with any of the game's mechanics, be that killing enemies, completing quests, anything that is progress in the game. The currency that you use for your character's development is experience points. And then as you collect enough experience points, you gain player levels. And what happens when you gain a player level is dependent on the game, but this allows you to measure your character's growth through how that happens. You can have faction or relationship experience or levels as you work for game non-player characters or game non-player character groups or entities. You can acquire experience that represents how trusted you are or the relationship that you've built with this entity over the course of your gameplay or your travels. And that can increase or it can also decrease. You can create some interesting experiences out of interesting decisions in, do I help this faction or that faction? Whichever faction I don't help, my relationship with them degrades. And so it becomes an interesting decision with some benefits and some detriments. It makes each decision have some effect on the world that has both positive components and negative components. Skill levels, how good your character is at doing something. In some games, this can be something like how good you are at chopping down trees, or how good you are at a particular wielding a sword, using a sword to quickly flurry the enemy, or a large scale charge and slam. We can talk about ranks. We can replace just numerical growth with English words. So instead of leveling from level 1 to level 2, you could level from a novice thief into a skilled thief, or something in between that allows the player to understand in terms of English, what does that development mean? Of course, if you're going to use something like skilled thief, you would expect now that when a player character plays a character that is a skilled thief, they feel like they are playing a skilled thief and not a novice +1 thief. So if you're going to make a change between two different English words, make sure that the player's experience matches that change as you do that. What is the difference between a level 1 thief and a level 5 thief? It's just a number. Depends on how those numbers fit into the rest of the game. So this is why a lot of designers default to using numbers rather than words, because words have connotations, and those connotations may be different to different players, and it may feel like there's some kind of disconnect between the player and the design if the player feels like they're playing a character that is not a skilled thief. You can put caps on stat gains, skill gains, levels, experience, to make sure that players can't become more powerful than the design that you are putting into your game. If your game doesn't have a defined ending, then placing that cap on player power allows the continuing of difficulty, or requires the player to continue to use skill rather than just overpower everything with numbers. Especially if it's a live service game or has player versus player components, you don't want just the player who's been playing longer to have an advantage solely because they've been playing longer. So all of their numbers are higher and skill is irrelevant. As you develop a game or a live service and release new content, you can raise that level cap to give people a reason, especially if they've reached the level cap, to come back and continue to play your game. Now there's something else for them to come back and gain and show mastery over. Question I have for the room: what's the best end game experience you've ever had? Thinking about that, dive into the actual design of that end game. Why was it so engaging for so long? Did it utilize any of these mechanics or any of these ideas? If so, how? If not, how is it different?
So with the new Monster game coming out, I feel like
Yeah.
this is a thematical. Back in it was Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. There were endgame monsters, which was probably the funnest version of the game I've experienced, because each of these monsters, at this point, you have the best armor, you're broken, but these monsters had even better armor to grind for. But here's the catch: each of them had a signature move that, regardless of where you were in the game, it would one-shot you. So
Yeah, it forces you to show mastery of certain concepts in the game, regardless of where you were. Was that a positive thing or a negative thing?
I think it was a pretty positive thing, especially like playing with my brother at the time. Like we specifically wouldn't join with other people because there's only 3 deaths and the run ends. So we trusted each other more than we trusted other people.
Yeah.
In case 3 people simultaneously got one-shotted and that was it.
Yeah, playing devil's advocate on that. That's very fun if that is possible for the player skill at the place in the game where it was designed. If you are not at that point, then it can feel like, well, how do I get to a point where I can conquer this mechanic, conquer this monster? Is there somewhere where I can go farm and get stronger? No, it's solely player skill. So making sure that maybe that's an optional mechanic, or that's something that is an opt-in, or there's something, another way that a player could get the same kinds of rewards, would allow different kinds of players, or maybe those who weren't as skilled yet, to be able to learn the game better before they're put in that situation. So there's definitely, I could see that being a positive thing and a negative thing, depending on who you are, who you're playing with. And yeah, that's a great conversation to have with regard to that, because it's an important design decision to get right. Because you're gonna make some proportion of your player base angry no matter what you do.
Right, and to leapfrog off of the same company that makes the game, their DMC series does that really well because of set difficulty levels of enemies.
Mhm.
And along with attack patterns and what they do, the best in game experience I had was fighting the final boss, who feels incredibly fair here to fight because Basic has the exact same mechanics as the player has.
Yeah.
So beating them means you understand and master the mechanics.
Yeah.
Granted, there's a very cheesy way to sort of one shot him if you knew what you were, but it made fighting them and beating them that much more rewarding because it showed that I progressed over this time and I did it over about 4 or 5 difficulty levels.
Mhm. Yeah, that's fair.
And there's also, in this edition of the game that I played, there is a training mode. You can specifically train against certain enemies. Is to try to get their attack patterns down and ways to beat them.
Yeah.
So there's lots of opportunities for you to grow, as your skill as a player, if you want to do that, or if you just want to have more casual experience on lower difficulties.
It's all fair. Yeah.
I was saying too, like the God of War Ragnarok ending, but I was gonna say like also like not alone with like skill, but like also like I feel like cinematics have a lot to like, or like maybe not even just cinematics, but like everything like climaxing to this like one peak like peak
Yeah.
moment. And I
And
like
like really tying everything together. Yeah,
I mean, but that game also had a lot of skill involved in it too, if you were playing on not like the story difficulty, but I would say like along with like the skill progression, like yeah, like cinematics and stuff like do a lot. But like there's nothing worse than getting to the end of the game. It's just like this like 5-10 second cutscene and it's like over and it like
Yeah,
underwhelming.
here are the credits. Buy our next game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to talk about this for about 5 hours because for me, Path of Exile 1 has the best end game that I've ever experienced from an economic perspective, from a player retention perspective, from a design perspective. Super intelligent. Other games do it very well for a more self-contained experience, but I find that designing an end game experience for a live service game is a massive challenge. That is not easy to do at all. To retain your players, to keep them coming back for a long period of time. If they take breaks, how do you take someone who was playing your game and bring them back? And how do you make all of this accessible to new players? All of that needs to be considered as part of the getting players to your end game and keeping them engaged for long periods of time when those caps are in place. Path of Exile does a phenomenal job at that. And there's a lot that I think that a lot of other designers could learn from what has been successful there. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Nothing ever is. But I spent a lot of time thinking about why that works so well. And I'd love to have individual conversations about that. That's something that interests people. Yeah.
Does a game need an end game?
No, not every game needs an end game. But I think for live service games, the money is made, and we'll get into this when we talk about game economies and how to monetize and market for different kinds of games. But the most successful single game that is possible is something that continues to keep people engaged, keep people paying for things, keeps the most people in the game and the most high-paying people in the game for some reason. And that is a big challenge. But yeah, no, if it's a single player game or a self-contained story, then we don't definitely need an endgame experience. but how do you get your players to play the next game that you release? How do you get them, the end game could be come back for our next release. How do you get a player to feel like they want to do that? So that is a great question. I don't think the answer is yes to every game needs an end game. Any other discussion points? Sure.
I guess going off of the beginning and end game, does a good game need every end game to be good? Cause I'm just thinking like everyone loves Minecraft, but honestly, beating the Ender Dragon and going to that end game is kind of mid.
Yeah, I would argue the end game of Minecraft is not something that the designers put in the game. It is the sandbox environment that they created. The sandbox environment is so good that people who play Minecraft continue to come back to that sandbox for hours and hours and hours and hours. Even as they create new content, it's content that's created for that experience, for the player to play the game the way that they want to play it. So player freedom is very important in an engaging, long end game experience. You can't have a designer tell you how to play the game and expect that they're going to want to stick around for years with that content. Player freedom is super important. One and two.
So I feel like determining like an end game can be kind of subjective, because say for like League of Legends, for example, is there an end game, or like
For which game?
like League of Legends, for example?
Oh, League of Legends.
You like play all the characters and lock them all.
The end game is deciding to quit.
Yes.
It's like Terraria, after you, is like, would you consider end game when you beat the wall of flash and go to like the second phase of the game, and was like
Yeah.
harder bosses? Like it'd be kind of subjective.
Yeah, it definitely can be subjective. I would say for Terraria, second difficulty after you've beaten everything, what is there left to do? Is there something worth farming for? Is there something worth, because kind of like Minecraft, Terraria doesn't tell you how to play the game. You can go off and construct, you could mine every single brick in the world and have it in your inventory. Or have it in treasure chests in a particular location and say, I took the entire world and put it in this one location. You could, there are so many ways and ridiculous ways that you could play the game that level of freedom creates the end game experience. Does that keep people engaged for hundreds of hours? It depends on who you are, but there is stuff to do at the end of the game that is engaging or motivating for certain types of players. And I would argue that that is the design of the end game. One, the two.
For the end game Minecraft, the only real sort of end game is when you start to go towards the very limited amount of bosses outside of the directive. It's when you start to like, okay, I'm gonna spawn in 12 withers because I want the nether star to create a bunch of beacons in my base. It eventually, Minecraft's end game is weird because it's basically how insane do you want their base to be at this point, now that you have broken equipment and a way to farm to get.
How large of a CPU can I create?
That's enough, if you're.
How
into
large of a
stuff,
computer can I
which is-
create? How
It depends upon
functional of a
your-
graphing calculator can I create?
It depends upon the edition of Minecraft you're playing, because Java is way jankier. And then how good your own CPU is to
Yeah,
basically create a VM of a computer inside of it.
but that's part of the end game, right? Is the freedom to now create whatever it is that you want to create.
Which-
You can take your knowledge of technology and reproduce that in the game.
Which, to sort of pop it off with more psychological aspect, is that like wide, expansive in possibilities once you have everything boring or intriguing to a person?
Right.
Because for some people, that limited space they have to work with is infinitely more fascinating to them than that just infinite possibility at the end of the game.
But also note, the reason Minecraft is so successful is it offers something for the widest variety of players. And I think that that's part of the genius of Minecraft's design is that it really does target as many people as possible. It gives almost everyone something to do. And that something doesn't have necessarily, for many of those people, it doesn't have a designed end. There's something over here. Yeah.
I tend to play a lot of endless games, but found that like, Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, a very interesting ending to me, because spend the whole game it's an RPG, but you never grind. You find a bunch of items, but you make your way through the story, and then just at the end of the game, the story wraps up and it just says goodbye.
Yeah.
It doesn't say come back, you missed something, doesn't say, hey, there's these items in the side quest, it just says, all right, you're gone.
Yeah. I mean, this could even come in story-driven games in a new game plus kind of mode where how can you reuse the same content that you already have, giving some players something to further do with your game and engage with your game that might become the reason that some players decide to pick up the game in the first place. Because it has this mode, because it has this level of flexibility at the very end, now I'm intrigued and I want to purchase the game. And it doesn't require a ton of extra development effort to put that in the game.
Response to the Minecraft thing is someone who doesn't play Minecraft, can Minecraft run Doom?
Minecraft can run
Theoretically-
Minecraft, so yes, it can
theoretically,
absolutely
yeah.
run Doom.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, Minecraft is a Turing complete system, so it can run any other Turing complete system.
If you can create a basic 32-bit system and find a way to program Doom onto it, technically you can, because you can create a RAM within Minecraft, you can create a CPU.
Terraria can run Doom. I mean, you'd have to be like, the input, you'd have to be running across pressure plates or something that would be annoying to play.
You can even find a way to create a very simple one where you have just a simple arrow, key and then a mouse and buttons, like how Doom is played, and then some basic other input keys. It'll just require a lot of time to engineer it because it has to be hyper specific in Minecraft. Because it's not very easy to run that sort of VM in Minecraft setting because of how big the actual computer has to be.
So if you're inspired this weekend, think some more about how the games you like design that system of continuing to keep player interest or draw players back in. I think there's a lot to be learned there, and there's a massive space in the game design industry for further developments in that area. But it again requires you to understand the human psychology of your players to understand what causes them to want to come back and play the game. That's a phenomenally interesting topic to me as well. So we're gonna transition and talk about some curves for game progression. So how do you, when you have this idea for a mechanic, how do you identify how it should progress? Where do you start with that? So this is gonna be a fairly short one. Because we're gonna dive into anchors next, which is the actual application of this idea of what do you base it on? Do you base it on other mechanics in your game? But let's first talk about how to think about these mechanics. So we can have some different kinds of numerical relationships. The first one you might consider is a trade-off relationship. So have your player give one thing up and then get something in exchange. So that's a trade-off relationship. You can have a progression relationship. This figures out, okay, how is the player going to progress through the game? How are we going to define that progression? And then how is it relevant or related to itself? How is player progression at level 10 related to player progression at level 5? It can be based in experience and levels, like I was just talking about, but also narrative. Player progress can be making progress through the game's story, improved player skill as they get better at the game. How are we defining getting better at the game? How are we measuring that from a design perspective? That all is under the hood of a progression relationship, and trying to understand that before players are actually playing your game will dictate whether your game is successful or not. It's important to note that while this is frequently seen as something that is mathematical, there's a massive component to this that is the player's perception of it. If you say, all right, player experience is going to be quadratic or exponential, what matters is not just the underlying math, but how players are perceiving the underlying math. You can say something like, well, this other game was successful implementing a quadratic level scaling, mine should be as well. If your players don't feel that way, then there's something different going on there. numbers aren't particularly absolute, they're all relative to each other. So 5 damage, what does that mean? Is that a lot? Is that a little? 1,000 damage, is that a lot or a little? It depends on how that compares to hit points, how that compares to other mechanics in your game. So how is it that you come to a conclusion that is the associated mathematical progression that maps how you want your player to perceive your game and the underlying math for the mechanic that you are designing? How do you do that? So we're going to dive into these different kinds of relationships in a little bit more detail so that you get a sense of how you might choose the kind of mathematical relationship that you want in your game. So for a trade-off relationship, tie it to time. So how much time did it take for the player to acquire what it is that you're asking them to give up? What is it that you're giving back to them? Being able to relate that to time will allow you to make some kind of trade-off that is fair. So there's a cost relationship between the player's time and every other resource in the game. How long did it take the player to acquire that? How long would it have taken the player to acquire whatever it is that you're giving them back? So curve types will make sense for different kinds of mechanics, especially within trade-off mechanics. Different ones are the identity curve. Anyone have a definition for the identity curve off the top of their head? Yeah, direct mapping of the input is the output. Yeah, whatever you give is what you receive. Linear, we all know what linear is. Polynomial, any kind of polynomial, quadratic, cubic, quartic, quintic. Exponential, 2 to the n factorial, n to the n, all of those fall within an exponential realm. Logarithmic, so just knowing again the different kinds of curves and what those look like can help you to very quickly identify, here's the base kind of curve that I would like to map to this particular mechanic. But you can also think about it as mechanic versus mechanic. So you would have one mechanic on the x-axis, one mechanic on the y-axis. What is the mathematical relationship between the progression of those two mechanics? Especially if they are related, especially if you can have a player trade them off. So I will exchange a certain amount of experience for a level. I will exchange a certain amount of currency for an item. I will exchange, whenever there's an opportunity for a player to do that kind of exchange, that is a trade-off relationship. So you should be able to know off the top of your head, if you're designing a game, how are two random but related mechanics in your game related to each other? If you can very quickly identify, well, they're linearly proportional, or they're exponentially proportional, or they're logarithmically proportional, that can help you to be able to understand your game at a mathematical level. Of course, identifying a pure mathematical curve doesn't always work. Sometimes you're going to need to create some kind of custom curve or custom progression. Here is an example of a couple of possible, this is kind of small. Squint or get up and move if you have to. I can't really blow it up easily. Or can I? I actually can. There we go, look at that. So here are two possible level curves. What do we notice about them? And thinking about this in the scope of a particular game, what might the benefits or detriments be to using one over the other?
Well, they're the same as level 12, but, level 13, the second one goes away, at a way smaller rate.
Yeah,
The one on the left looks like it's doing a standard, every level requires twice as much as the one, twice
Yeah.
as much XP. And the right one does it up till 12 and then it like tapers back, which
twice.
I-
Yeah, that's the term for that.
my guess for why you would want to implement something like this is because if you just did a straight every level of the double, then you'd end up there, players would just never get to the higher levels. At some point.
Well, you'd have to design for that, right?
But yeah, but the amount of XP would just be insane, so if you're giving out relatively constant amount of XP. And you're not dramatically increasing the XP along with the curve, then players would just never get to the higher levels.
Yeah.
That's why the one on the right tapers off, so you can actually, you actually get a consistent feeling of progression at the higher levels.
So yeah, something on the left is purely exponential. Every single level requires twice as much. If you're a designer thinking about this, you can ask yourself from each level. How many monsters would it require? How many monster kills would it require to level up? Do we want that to be consistent across the game? How many monster kills does it require if the player is 1 level over the intended area, 4 levels over the intended area, 3 levels behind the intended area? And if this is consistent across this, something like we designed the first level, the first game level, to be for player levels up to 4. And then the next one to be up to 6, and the next one to be up to 8, and the next one to be up to 10. Then in each one of those areas, the monsters have to give you twice as much experience to keep up with that exponential curve. On the other hand, if the goal is to require more and more and more monster kills, and you want to make it more and more and more challenging to grind for those later levels, then something on the right can still make sense. You just taper off the experience that monsters give, and now you can grind in an area that is close to the end of the game and at the end of the game and make close to the same progress because they're not tapering off as much. But it still requires more and more and more monster kills to get to each associated level. So staring at this and thinking about it not just as a pure math function, but as you break it down into what is it like from the player's perspective, then you can start to piecewise come up with, all right, we're going to have exponential for a while, but then it makes sense to move from exponential to polynomial. And you get something that looks more like what's happening here on the right. And maybe that's more desirable. Maybe what's on the left is more desirable, but it depends on what you're trying to get out of the player experience. So trying to tie mathematical progression to player experience is something that's very challenging, but something that is worth thinking about when you design each of these systems. All right, let's do a quick case study with the last couple minutes we have in class. Enemies have 4 hit points. That's just something that's locked in place for the moment. And you are designing skills that deal 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 damage. How are you going to assign how much mana points, magic points, whatever you want MP to stand for, how much is it going to cost in terms of a magical resource to use each one of these skills? Should this be a linear increase? Should this be an exponential increase? Should it be a logarithmic increase? How would you make these skills useful and relevant in different situations? If they all cost the same, they all cost 1 MP. So it's not an interesting decision anymore. The player is going to do whatever deals 5 damage. How would you balance this in terms of its cost to make it interesting? And I'll let you just stew on that for a minute. So don't worry about how much MP a character has, just the relative costs between the skills. This is something we can come back and balance max MP later.
This game turn-based?
Doesn't matter.
So just to clarify, we're saying the set of all enemies have 4 hit points.
Yes, all enemies have 4 hit points. But the idea is that there should be some kind of trade-off between using these skills. Some of them should be more efficient or less efficient. Some of them should be, what is the cost of a one-shot? What is it like to use a skill that does 2 damage versus 3 damage? What does that mean? Can you make that an interesting decision? We are just about out of time, so I'm going to have you stew on this over the weekend. If you'd like to think about this, we'll come back and discuss this first thing on Monday. Do note that what is coming is this balancing of an idle game on a spreadsheet. So bring some kind of machine. We will actually be down in the lab on Monday, so be able to log into a machine that uses some kind of spreadsheet application. So bring something that can use a spreadsheet application on Monday. Have a great weekend. You have a few minutes. Go down to one of the labs and laugh at the people taking the egg. Don't actually do that. You go wish them good skill.
I guess they're on Steam instead.